The air in the small church was stifling on that hot June afternoon in 1875. Sweat trickled down Eleanor Thompson's back beneath the wedding dress her mother had hastily altered. She stared at the weathered floorboards of the church in Sweetwater Creek, Arizona territory, refusing to meet the eyes of the stranger who stood beside her, the man who in mere minutes would become her husband. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she listened to the droning voice of the preacher. How had it come to this? Just 3 weeks ago, she had been teaching school back east, secure in her independence and plans. Now she stood trembling in a frontier church, being married off to a man she'd never met before yesterday. A hardened rancher named Mason Blackwell. Eleanor clutched her small bouquet of wildflowers so tightly that her knuckles turned white. This was her father's final punishment, forcing her to marry a stranger before he died, ensuring she would remain in this dusty, lawless territory forever. I hope you're enjoying this story. If you are, please consider subscribing to the channel. I'd love to know what city you're watching from. Mason's voice rumbled deep and steady as he recited his vows, the sound seeming to vibrate through the wooden floor and up into Eleanor's bones. At 38, he was nearly 15 years her senior, with a face weathered by sun and hardship. His reputation in Sweetwater Creek preceded him, a successful cattle rancher with a mysterious past, a man of few words who kept to himself on his sprawling ranch 10 miles outside of town. The stories about him varied wildly. Some said he'd been a Union officer during the war. Others claimed he'd ridden with outlaws before settling down. All Eleanor knew for certain was that her dying father owed this man a considerable debt, and she was the payment. She had arrived on the stagecoach just yesterday, exhausted and heartbroken, to find arrangements already made for a wedding she never wanted. When they'd been introduced, Mason had simply nodded at her, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. Not once had he smiled. "Miss Thompson?" the preacher prompted, pulling Eleanor from her thoughts. It was her turn to speak the vows that would chain her to this stranger for life. She swallowed hard, tasting bitterness. The small congregation, mostly curious townspeople she didn't know, waited in uncomfortable silence. Her father hadn't even managed to attend, confined to his bed in the doctor's house across town. Eleanor parted her dry lips, the words catching in her throat. For one wild moment, she considered running, fleeing back to the stagecoach office and purchasing a ticket east with the meager savings hidden in her trunk. But where would she go? Her teaching position had already been filled. Her mother was long dead. She had no siblings, no aunts or uncles who would take her in. Her father's final manipulation had worked perfectly. She had nowhere else to turn. "I do," she finally whispered, the words falling like stones in the quiet church. She felt, rather than saw, Mason shift beside her. His calloused hand reached for hers, rough skin against her smooth palm as he slid a simple gold band onto her finger. It was slightly too large, sliding loosely past her knuckle. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Eleanor finally forced herself to look up at the man she had just married. Mason Blackwell's eyes were startlingly blue against his sun-darkened face, deep-set beneath heavy brows. A jagged scar ran along his jawline, disappearing into the collar of his shirt. Those eyes studied her now, with an intensity that made her breath catch. But she could read nothing of his thoughts. When he leaned down to place the customary kiss upon her lips, Eleanor steeled herself, determined not to flinch. His breath smelled of coffee as it whispered against her face, and then his lips pressed against hers, gently, far more gently than she had expected. It was brief, barely a moment of contact. But in that instant, Eleanor felt something unexpected pass between them. Not passion or love, certainly, but something else, something almost like uncertainty. It was the first hint that perhaps Mason Blackwell wasn't exactly what the rumors had claimed. The small reception at the town hotel lasted less than an hour. Eleanor sat stiffly beside her new husband, barely touching the cake placed before her, responding with polite smiles to the well wishes of strangers. Mason spoke little, answering questions with short, direct responses, his hand occasionally coming to rest on the small of her back, a gesture that seemed more protective than possessive. Sheriff Donovan Taylor, a man with kind eyes and graying temples, shook Mason's hand firmly. "You got yourself a fine wife, Blackwell. Treat her right." There was something in the sheriff's tone that sounded like a warning, and Eleanor wondered what history existed between the two men. Before she could ponder it further, Dr. Morris appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. "Miss Thompson, Mrs. Blackwell, I mean, your father is asking for you. I don't think you'll last through the night." The small bedroom smelled of illness and medicine. Eleanor's father lay against the pillows, his once robust frame now wasted and frail. Thomas Thompson had been a difficult man in health. In sickness, he had become impossible, bitter with the knowledge that the consumption was winning. His rheumy eyes fixed on Eleanor as she entered. "So, it's done then," he wheezed. Eleanor nodded, not trusting herself to speak without letting her anger show. Her father's lips curled into what might have been a smile. "Good. My debt is paid." He beckoned her closer with one skeletal hand. "You think I've been cruel, sending for you, arranging this marriage? But you'll see, Eleanor, Blackwell is a good man, better than most, better than me." He dissolved into a fit of coughing that left blood speckling his lips. Eleanor mechanically reached for a cloth to dab it away, as she had done for the past week since her arrival. "Why him?" she finally asked, the question that had been burning inside her. "Of all the men in this territory, why choose him to settle your debt?" Her father's eyes slid away from hers, fixing on the wall. "That's between Blackwell and me. Just know that when I'm gone, you'll be provided for. His ranch is prosperous. You won't want for anything." Another coughing fit seized him, worse than before. When it passed, he gripped her wrist with surprising strength. "Promise me you'll stay, Eleanor. No running back east. Promise me." Eleanor stared at the man who had rarely shown her kindness, who had sent her away to boarding school after her mother died, who had summoned her to this frontier town only to marry her off to a stranger before dying himself. Yet he was still her father, and these would be among his last words to her. "I promise," she said quietly. Something like relief passed over Thomas Thompson's gaunt face, and he released her wrist, sinking back into the pillows. When Eleanor emerged from the doctor's house, the afternoon sun was sinking toward the western mountains, painting the dusty main street of Sweetwater Creek in hues of gold and amber. Mason waited for her, holding the reins of two horses, a sturdy chestnut gelding for himself and a smaller dappled mare for her. He stood straight-backed against the setting sun, his broad shoulders outlined in light. For the first time, Eleanor truly looked at the man she had married. He was tall, at least 6 feet, with the lean, muscular build of someone who worked the land. His face was all hard angles and weathered lines, but there was a steadiness to him, a solid presence that seemed immovable as the mountains on the horizon. When he saw her, he crossed to her side in a few long strides. "Your father?" he asked simply. Eleanor shook her head. Not yet, but soon. Mason nodded, accepting her words without empty condolences. We should head to the ranch before dark, he said, gesturing toward the horses. Can you ride? Eleanor nodded. Despite her Eastern education, she had grown up riding on her grandfather's farm in Pennsylvania. Mason seemed satisfied with her answer, helping her mount the mare before swinging easily onto his own horse. As they rode out of town, Eleanor felt the curious gazes of townspeople following them. The school teacher from back east, now married to the mysterious rancher. Already she could imagine the gossip spreading through Sweetwater Creek. She sat straight in the saddle, determined not to give them anything more to talk about. Beside her, Mason rode in silence. His eyes scanned. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, and lanterns glowed in the windows against the gathering dusk. Several outbuildings dotted the property, a barn, bunkhouse, smokehouse, and what appeared to be a workshop of some kind. In the nearest pasture, cattle grazed peacefully. It was, Eleanor had to admit, a beautiful and prosperous-looking place, far more established than many of the homesteads she'd passed on her journey west. As they approached, a figure emerged from the barn, a lean, weathered man with iron-gray hair who raised a hand in greeting. "That's Samuel," Mason explained, breaking his long silence. "He helps me run things. Been with me since I started this place." The older man approached as they dismounted, taking the reins of both horses. His shrewd eyes assessed Eleanor quickly before turning to Mason. "Everything ready in the house, like you asked," he said, his voice carrying a hint of an accent Eleanor couldn't quite place. "Sarah's laid out supper in the dining room." Mason nodded his thanks, then turned to Eleanor. "Sarah is Samuel's wife. She cooks and helps keep the house. They live in the smaller cabin beyond the workshop." He hesitated, seeming to search for words, the first sign of uncertainty she'd seen in him. "I know this isn't what you wanted," he finally said, his deep voice pitched low so that only she could hear. "But I aim to be fair with you, Mrs. Blackwell. This is your home now, and you'll be treated with respect here." Before Eleanor could respond, he turned and gestured toward the house. "You must be tired after everything. Let me show you inside." The interior of the ranch house surprised Eleanor even more than its exterior. She had expected a bachelor's sparse accommodations, but the rooms were well appointed with solid furniture, colorful rugs, and even a few paintings adorning the walls. A large stone fireplace dominated the main sitting room, with comfortable-looking chairs arranged before it. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes that made Eleanor's heart leap with unexpected pleasure. Mason watched her reaction as she took in the room. "The previous owner's wife had a fondness for making a proper home," he explained. "I kept things as they were." He led her through to a dining room where a hot meal waited on the table: roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and what smelled like apple pie cooling on the sideboard. "You should eat," Mason said. "It's been a long day." Eleanor suddenly realized she was indeed hungry, having eaten almost nothing at the reception. They ate in relative silence, the awkwardness of their situation hanging between them. Eleanor found herself stealing glances at her new husband, trying to reconcile the gentle way he broke his bread with the hard lines of his face and the rumors of his dangerous past. Once, she caught him watching her in return, his blue eyes quickly dropping to his plate when she looked up. After the meal, Mason showed her upstairs to a large bedroom with a 4-poster bed covered in a handmade quilt. A washstand with fresh water stood in one corner, and a wardrobe waited for her few belongings. "This is your room," Mason said, standing in the doorway as if reluctant to enter the space. Eleanor turned to him in confusion. "Your trunk arrived yesterday. Sarah put your things in the wardrobe." He shifted his weight slightly. "My room is across the hall, should you need anything." And with that surprising statement, he bid her good night and closed the door, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts. For a long time, Eleanor stood in the center of the room, trying to understand what had just happened. He had given her a separate bedroom. They were legally married, yet he had made no move to claim his husbandly rights. Was it consideration for her feelings, or did he simply not desire her? The thought brought a flush to her cheeks, not of relief, as it should have been, but something more complicated. She moved to the window, pushing aside the curtain to look out at the night. The moon had risen, casting silver light across the valley and glinting off the distant creek. It was beautiful, she had to admit, this wild country so different from the crowded eastern cities she knew. A soft knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. When she opened it, she found a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair pulled into a practical bun. "Mrs. Blackwell, I'm Sarah," the woman said with a gentle smile. "I've brought you some hot water for washing and a nightgown from your things." The next morning, Eleanor woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the distant sounds of ranch life already in progress. Men's voices calling to one another, the lowing of cattle, the clang of metal from what must be the smithy. For a moment, she lay disoriented, before the events of the previous day came rushing back. She was married. Her father was likely dead by now, and this remote ranch was her home. She dressed quickly in one of her simpler dresses, pinned up her honey-brown hair, and made her way downstairs. Sarah was in the kitchen, kneading dough at a large wooden table. The older woman smiled when she saw Eleanor. "Good morning, Mrs. Blackwell. There's coffee and breakfast keeping warm for you. The master's been up since before dawn, checking the north pasture with the hands." Eleanor returned the smile tentatively. "Please, call me Eleanor." Sarah nodded, seeming pleased with this request. "Mr. Blackwell said to tell you he'd be back mid-morning and would like to show you around the property, if you're willing." True to his word, Mason returned as the sun reached its mid-morning position. Eleanor was on the front porch, a book from his shelf open on her lap, though she had read the same page 3 times without absorbing the words. He approached on foot, having left his horse at the barn, his long stride eating up the distance between them. In the clear light of day, Eleanor noted details she had missed before, the way his dark hair curled slightly where it touched his collar, the faint lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he might smile more than she'd yet witnessed. "Your father passed during the night," he said without preamble as he reached the porch steps. "Doc Morris sent word with one of the hands. The burial will be tomorrow at noon." Eleanor nodded, feeling strangely numb. She had grieved the loss of her father years ago, when he'd sent her away after her mother's death. His physical passing seemed almost an afterthought to that earlier abandonment. "Would you like to see the ranch now, or would you prefer some time alone?" Mason asked, his deep voice gentler than before. Eleanor set aside her book and stood. "I'd like to see it, please. I should know my new home." Something flickered in Mason's eyes at her words. Approval, perhaps, or relief. He offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. They walked first to the barn, where Mason introduced her to the horses, his chestnut gelding Thunder, and her dappled mare Willow. "She's yours now," he said as the mare nuzzled Eleanor's palm. "I bought her in town last week, after your father's letter arrived." The casual mention of preparation for her arrival caught Eleanor by surprise. Beyond the barn, Mason showed her the bunkhouse where his 4 ranch hands lived, the smokehouse, the workshop where Samuel was repairing a saddle, and finally, a small fenced garden behind the main house. Sarah tends most of it, Mason explained as they walked between rows of vegetables and herbs. But there's space for you to plant whatever you'd like. He paused beside a section of turned earth. I understand you were a teacher back east. What did you teach? The question surprised Eleanor. It was the first personal inquiry he had made. Everything, really. Reading, writing, arithmetic, history. It was a small school. Mason nodded thoughtfully. There's no proper school in Sweetwater Creek yet. Some talk of building one next year. They continued walking, coming to a stop beside an apple tree in bloom, its delicate white flowers fluttering in the gentle breeze. Mason seemed to be working himself up to say something, his usually impassive face betraying a hint of inner conflict. Mrs. Blackwell, Eleanor, I know this marriage wasn't your choice. I want you to understand that I don't expect. He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with the subject. Why did you agree to it? Eleanor asked, the question that had been burning inside her since she'd arrived in Sweetwater Creek. You could have simply demanded your money from my father. Why take me instead? Mason's gaze fixed on the distant mountains. Your father owed me more than money could repay. Something in his tone made Eleanor suspect there was much more to the story than a simple debt. What happened between you? She pressed. Jaw tightened beneath the stubble that shadowed his face. That's a long story, and not one for today. He turned to face her fully, his blue eyes meeting hers directly. But you should know that I mean to honor our arrangement. This is your home now, for as long as you wish it to be. I won't hold you here against your will, but I hope you'll give this place, give us, a chance. There was something in his expression, a vulnerability beneath the strength, that touched Eleanor unexpectedly. Before she could respond, the dinner bell rang from the main house, and the moment passed. The following day, Eleanor stood beside Mason as her father was lowered into the hard Arizona soil. The simple ceremony was attended by a handful of townspeople, more out of respect for the traditional observances than any particular fondness for Thomas Thompson, who had only lived in Sweetwater Creek for 6 months before falling ill. Sheriff Taylor was there, along with Dr. Morris, the preacher, and a few others Eleanor didn't recognize. She wore her best black dress, already too warm in the midday sun, and held a small bouquet of wildflowers Sarah had gathered that morning. When the preacher asked if anyone wished to speak, Eleanor remained silent. What could she say about the father who had been a stranger to her for most of her life? It was Mason who stepped forward, surprising everyone, including Eleanor. Thomas Thompson was a complicated man, he began, his deep voice carrying easily in the quiet cemetery. He made mistakes, as we all do, but in the end, he tried to set things right in his own way. May he find the peace in death that eluded him in life. His simple eulogy said everything and nothing, leaving Eleanor to wonder once again what history lay between her father and her new husband. As they rode back to the ranch, Eleanor's thoughts churned with questions. Mason rode beside her, silent as usual, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. Finally, she could contain her curiosity no longer. At the cemetery, you spoke as if you knew my father well, yet he only moved to Sweetwater Creek recently. How did you come to know him? Mason was quiet for so long that Eleanor thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his words were measured, as if carefully chosen. I knew your father before he came to Arizona, back in Missouri, after the war. This was news to Eleanor. Her father had never mentioned living in Missouri. We had business together, Mason continued. It went badly. He left owing me a considerable sum, and more than that. He glanced at her, then away. The details aren't important now. What matters is that when he wrote to me, dying and concerned for your future, I saw a chance to settle old scores in a way that might benefit us both. By marrying me, Eleanor couldn't keep the edge from her voice. Mason reined his horse to a stop, turning in the saddle to face her fully. By offering you a home and security in a territory where a single woman has few prospects. Your father knew that. His blue eyes held hers steadily. I won't pretend there was no satisfaction in having Thomas Thompson in my debt until the end. But my agreement to marry you wasn't about revenge, Eleanor. It was about honoring a promise I made long ago. Before she could ask what promise he meant, a rider appeared on the trail ahead, approaching fast. Mason's hand moved instinctively to the revolver at his hip, relaxing only when the rider drew close enough to recognize one of the ranch hands, a young man named Charlie. "Mr. Blackwell," the youth called, pulling his lathered horse to a stop. "Trouble at the north fence line. Riders cutting your wire. Samuel sent me to fetch you." Mason's expression hardened instantly. "Get back to the ranch," he told Eleanor, his tone brooking no argument. "Tell Sarah what's happening. She'll know what to do." With that, he spurred his horse forward, following Charlie at a gallop and leaving Eleanor with far more questions than answers. By the time Eleanor reached the ranch, her mind was racing with possibilities. She delivered Mason's message to Sarah, who immediately sent another hand to town for the sheriff, while instructing the remaining man to keep watch from the barn roof. "This has happened before," Sarah explained as she loaded a shotgun with practiced ease. "There's a rancher north of here, Victor Hardin, who doesn't take kindly to Mason's success. He wants this valley for himself, claims his cattle need the water from our creek." She handed the weapon to Eleanor, who took it automatically, surprised by its weight. "Do you know how to use one of these?" Eleanor shook her head. "Then stay in the house, near the back where you can't be seen from the road. I'll be in the kitchen. If anyone but Mason or our boys approaches, you call for me. Understand?" Eleanor nodded, a chill running through her despite the warm day. Whatever feud existed between Mason and this Hardin person, it was serious enough that Sarah was prepared for violence. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Eleanor paced from window to window, scanning the property for any sign of Mason's return. The shadows lengthened across the valley as afternoon gave way to evening, and still no riders appeared. Sarah prepared a simple supper, though neither woman had much appetite. "Tell me about Mason," Eleanor said as they sat at the kitchen table, more to distract herself from worry than anything else. "How long have you known him?" Sarah's weathered face softened slightly. "Going on 15 years now. Samuel and I were headed west after the war, our farm in Tennessee burned by Union soldiers. We had nothing left. Mason found us on the trail, half-starved and desperate. He was just starting this place, needed help. Hired Samuel on the spot, gave us a cabin to live in, treated us like family." She looked at Eleanor directly. "He's a good man, Mrs. Blackwell. Whatever you've heard about him, whatever your father might have said, Mason Blackwell is a man of his word, with a sense of honor you don't find often these days." Darkness had fallen completely when they finally heard horses approaching. Eleanor rushed to the front door, Sarah close behind with the shotgun still in hand. Lantern light spilled onto the porch as 4 riders came into view. Mason, Charlie, the other hand who had been sent for the sheriff, and Sheriff Taylor himself. Relief flooded through Eleanor at the sight of them, all apparently unharmed. Mason dismounted wearily, handing his reins to Charlie before climbing the porch steps. There was dirt on his clothing and a smear of what might have been blood on his sleeve, but he seemed otherwise uninjured. Hardin's men cut about 50 yards of fence. he reported to Sarah. "We caught them at it. There was a scuffle, but no serious injuries. The sheriff's taking 2 of them back to town." He turned to Eleanor, something softening in his expression. "I'm sorry about this welcome to the ranch. Hardin's been a problem for some time, but it's nothing for you to worry about." Sheriff Taylor tipped his hat to Eleanor as he prepared to leave. "Mrs. Blackwell, sorry we're meeting again under these circumstances." He turned to Mason, his expression serious. "You know Hardin won't let this go, Mason. Might be time to consider my offer." Mason's jaw tightened. "I appreciate your concern, Sheriff, but I've got no intention of selling land or water rights to Hardin or anyone else. This ranch stays intact." After the sheriff departed, Sarah insisted on checking Mason for injuries, despite his protests that he was fine. She eventually returned to her cabin with Samuel, leaving Eleanor alone with her husband for the first time since morning. Mason sank into one of the chairs by the fireplace, looking exhausted. Without thinking, Eleanor poured him a measure of whiskey from the decanter on the sideboard and brought it to him. He accepted it with a nod of thanks, watching her over the rim of the glass as she took the chair opposite his. "Is this what life is like here?" Eleanor asked after a moment of silence. "Feuds and cut fences and armed standoffs?" Mason sighed, setting down his empty glass. "Not usually, no. Hardin's a special case. A man who thinks money and intimidation can get him whatever he wants. He's been trying to force me out for 2 years. He rubbed a hand over his face, the gesture making him look suddenly vulnerable. "Most days, this is a good place, peaceful. The work is hard but honest. The land gives back what you put into it." His blue eyes met hers in the firelight. "I meant what I said earlier. This place can be your home, Eleanor, truly your home, if you want it to be. I know our arrangement is unusual, but perhaps in time." He trailed off, leaving the thought unfinished. Eleanor found herself studying him, the strong line of his jaw, the scar that traced its edge, the weariness in his eyes that couldn't quite mask something deeper, something that looked almost like longing. "You've been kind," she acknowledged softly. "Far kinder than I expected, given the circumstances. But there's so much I don't understand, Mason. About you, about my father, about why I'm really here." She leaned forward in her chair. "You said earlier that you made a promise long ago. What did you mean?" Mason's expression changed, closing like a door shutting against a storm. "It's late," he said, rising from his chair. "We should both get some rest." Eleanor stood as well, frustration rising within her. "How can I make this my home if you keep secrets about why I'm here in the first place?" Mason paused at the foot of the stairs, his broad shoulders tense beneath his shirt. For a moment, Eleanor thought he might finally explain, but instead he simply said, "Good night, Eleanor," and climbed the stairs, leaving her alone with her unanswered questions. The next morning, Eleanor woke to the sound of hammering outside. She dressed quickly and went to the window, where she could see Mason and 2 of the ranch hands loading wooden fence posts and coils of wire into a wagon. They were preparing to repair the damage from yesterday's incident. Without giving herself time to reconsider, Eleanor hurried downstairs and out to the barn. Mason looked up in surprise as she approached. "I want to come with you," she stated firmly, "to help with the fence." Mason's eyebrows rose slightly, the most expression she had seen on his face yet. "It's not necessary," he began, but Eleanor cut him off. "I know it's not necessary. I want to help. This is my home now too, isn't it? I should learn how it's run." Something flickered in Mason's eyes, respect perhaps, or approval. After a moment's consideration, he nodded. "It'll be a long, hot day," he warned. "Are you sure?" Eleanor lifted her chin. I'm sure. The work was indeed grueling under the relentless Arizona sun. Eleanor's hands, soft from years of teaching, quickly developed blisters that she helped hold posts steady while Mason and Charlie drove them into the hard ground. Samuel showed her how to stretch and secure the wire, his patient instruction reminding her of her grandfather. By midday, they had repaired half the damaged section, and Eleanor's muscles ached with a deep, satisfying tiredness unlike anything she had experienced before. During their brief rest for a meal of cold beef sandwiches and water from canteens, she caught Mason watching her with an unreadable expression. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious of her disheveled appearance and dirt-streaked clothing. "Nothing," he replied, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "Just thinking that you're not what I expected, Eleanor Thompson." She returned his almost smile with one of her own. "It's Eleanor Blackwell now, remember?" As they worked through the afternoon, Eleanor found herself stealing glances at her husband. With his sleeves rolled up and his hat shading his face from the sun, she could see the strength in his arms and shoulders as he drove posts into the ground with powerful swings of a heavy mallet. Sweat darkened his shirt across his back, and despite herself, Eleanor felt a flutter of awareness deep within her, an unexpected appreciation for his physical presence that took her by surprise. When he caught her looking, she quickly turned away, focusing intently on the wire in her hands. The work continued until the shadows lengthened across the range, the fence finally restored to its original condition. As they packed the tools back into the wagon, Mason approached her, concern evident in his expression. "Your hands," he said, gently taking one of hers in his much larger one. Eleanor looked down to see several blisters had broken, leaving her palms raw and sore. "It's nothing," she began, but Mason shook his head. "Samuel, take the wagon back," he called. "Mrs. Blackwell and I will ride." The creek where Mason stopped their horses was a welcome sight after the long, dusty day. "This is the heart of the ranch," he explained as they dismounted. "The water that makes everything possible out here." He led her to a spot where the creek widened into a shallow pool, the water clear and cool. "Let me see your hands," he said, his deep voice gentle. Eleanor hesitated only briefly before extending her palms. Mason knelt beside the creek, guiding her hands into the cool water. The relief was immediate, the sting of the blisters soothed by the gentle current. Mason's own hands, large and calloused, supported hers beneath the surface. "My mother used to say creek water had healing powers," he said, his voice softening with memory. She was part Cherokee, knew all the old ways of healing. It was the first personal detail he had volunteered about himself, and Eleanor found herself hungry for more. "Where did you grow up?" she asked, watching his face in the golden light of the setting sun. "Missouri," he replied after a moment. "Small farm near the Kansas border. Before the war, it was good country." Something dark crossed his expression. After, not so much. He carefully withdrew her hands from the water, examining the blisters. "These need tending," he said, his tone shifting back to practical concern. From his saddlebag, he produced a small tin of salve. "Sarah makes this from beeswax and herbs," he explained as he carefully spread the ointment over her palms. His touch was surprisingly gentle for hands so large and weathered. "It'll help them heal and toughen up." The intimacy of the moment, his fingers moving carefully across her skin, his head bent close to hers, brought a flush to Eleanor's cheeks that had nothing to do with the day's sun. When he finished, his hands lingered around hers for a heartbeat longer than necessary before he released them. "Thank you," she said softly, and she meant for more than just the salve. As they rode back to the ranch house, the first stars appearing in the darkening sky, Eleanor found her curiosity about her husband growing stronger. "Mason," she began, testing the feel of his name on her lips, "will you tell me something true about yourself? Something no one else here knows?" He glanced at her, surprise evident in his expression, before turning his gaze back to the trail ahead. For so long that Eleanor thought he might not answer, Mason rode in silence. Just as the lights of the ranch house came into view, he spoke. "I was married once before." The simple statement hung in the air between them. "During the war. Her name was Caroline. She died in childbirth while I was away fighting. The baby, too." His voice carried no emotion, but Eleanor could sense the depth of old pain beneath his words. "I'm sorry," she said softly, understanding now at least part of his reluctance to claim his husbandly rights. Mason nodded once, acknowledgement of her sympathy, before urging his horse forward toward the waiting warmth of the house. That night, Eleanor lay awake, long after the household had gone quiet, her mind replaying the day's events. The image of Mason kneeling by the creek, tenderly caring for her blistered hands, contrasted sharply with the hard, distant man she had married just days before. There were layers to him she was only beginning to glimpse: pain and strength, gentleness and resolve. She wondered about the woman he had loved and lost, about the child who never drew breath. How had those losses shaped the man who now slept across the hall? And what of her father's debt? What promise had Mason made that led him to marry a stranger? Questions circled in her mind until weariness finally pulled her into sleep, her dreams filled with blue eyes that held secrets she couldn't quite grasp. The following days fell into a rhythm of ranch life that Eleanor found unexpectedly satisfying. She rose early each morning, helping Sarah with breakfast for the men before they headed out to their various tasks. Mason often left before dawn to ride the property with Samuel, checking cattle, water sources, and fence lines. Eleanor busied herself learning the workings of the household, the pantry inventory, the laundry schedule, the garden that provided much of their fresh food. In the afternoons, when the Arizona heat was most intense, she retreated to the relative cool of the house, reading from Mason's surprisingly extensive library or writing letters to the few friends she had back east. Sometimes she would sit on the porch, with mending or a book, watching the distant figure of her husband as he worked with the horses in the corral or conferred with his men near the barn. Occasionally, he would glance toward the house, as if aware of her gaze upon him. A week after the fence-cutting incident, Sheriff Taylor rode out to the ranch with news. Eleanor was in the garden, harvesting tomatoes for Sarah, when she heard the approach of a horse. Setting down her basket, she shaded her eyes against the morning sun to see the sheriff dismounting by the hitching post. Mason emerged from the barn to greet him, the two men shaking hands before walking toward the house in serious conversation. Eleanor gathered her basket and followed, curiosity drawing her toward whatever news had brought the sheriff all the way from town. She entered through the kitchen, where Sarah was kneading bread dough. "The sheriff's here," Eleanor said, setting down the tomatoes. Sarah nodded, her expression worried. "I saw him ride in. Never a good sign these days." They both fell silent as Mason and Sheriff Taylor entered from the front of the house. Mason's face was set in grim lines, his jaw tight. "Mrs. Blackwell," the sheriff greeted her with a nod. "Sorry to bring trouble to your door, but I thought Mason should hear this directly from me." He accepted the cup of coffee Sarah poured him with a grateful nod. "Victor Hardin's been making noise in town, claiming this land rightfully belongs to him. Says he has papers to prove it. Mason's hand tightened around his coffee cup. We both know that's a lie, Sheriff. My deed is registered and legal. Judge Wilson himself signed off on it 7 years ago. The sheriff nodded. I know that, Mason. But Hardin's hired himself a fancy lawyer from Tucson, who's filing all sorts of claims and petitions. And he's bringing in more men, rough sorts, not regular ranch hands. He looked Mason directly in the eye. I'm worried he's planning something bigger than cutting fences. Eleanor watched as Mason absorbed this news, his blue eyes darkening with anger. Let him try, he said simply, the quiet menace in his voice sending a chill through her. Sheriff Taylor sighed. Mason, I'm telling you this as a friend. Hardin has money and connections all the way to the territorial capital. This legal battle could drag on for years, bleeding you dry. And if he can't beat you in court, I'm concerned about what else he might try. The man has no scruples. He hesitated, glancing briefly at Eleanor before continuing, especially now that you have a wife to consider. The implication was clear. Mason's marriage had given him a new vulnerability, one that Hardin might exploit. Eleanor's stomach tightened at the thought. Mason must have had the same realization, for his expression hardened further. I appreciate the warning, Sheriff. I'll make arrangements. After the sheriff departed, Mason paced the length of the sitting room while Eleanor watched from her seat near the fireplace. Is this Hardin truly so dangerous? She finally asked. Mason paused in his pacing, turning to face her. Victor Hardin is a man who believes money entitles him to whatever he wants. When he can't buy something, he takes it by force. He's been trying to get this ranch since he moved into the territory 3 years ago. He ran a hand through his dark hair, a rare gesture of frustration. The water rights are what he's really after. This creek is the most reliable water source in the valley. Whoever controls it controls everything else. Eleanor considered this information. The sheriff seems to think you, should be concerned about more than legal challenges. Mason's jaw tightened. Hardin's not above using intimidation, or worse. What are you going to do? Eleanor asked, rising from her chair to approach him. Mason looked down at her, conflict evident in his eyes. I'm not selling, if that's what you're asking. This land is mine, fair and square. I built everything here from nothing. His voice carried a fierce determination that impressed Eleanor. Then we'll fight, she said firmly. Mason blinked, clearly surprised by her use of we. A shadow of something like warmth passed across his features. It won't be easy, he warned. Or safe. Maybe you should consider... Eleanor cut him off. This is my home now too, Mason. I won't be driven from it by threats. She surprised herself with the vehemence of her declaration, but as the words left her mouth, she realized they were true. In just over a week, this ranch had begun to feel more like home than anywhere she had lived since childhood. That evening, Eleanor sat at the small desk in her bedroom, writing in the journal she had kept since her school days. She had just finished recording the sheriff's visit when a soft knock sounded at her door. Setting aside her pen, she crossed the room and opened the door to find Mason standing in the hallway, a package in his hands. May I come in? He asked, his deep voice rumbling softly in the quiet house. Eleanor nodded, stepping back to allow him entry. It was the first time he had entered her bedroom since showing it to her on their wedding night. Mason glanced around the room, noting the small touches Eleanor had added. Wildflowers in a jar on the windowsill, her books and writing materials arranged on the desk, a shawl draped over the back of the chair. I have something for you, he said, extending the package toward her. I meant to give it to you earlier, but with everything that's happened. Eleanor accepted the package with surprise. It was wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with string. What is it? She asked, looking up at Mason's face. Open it, he encouraged. A hint of what might have been nervousness in his usually confident demeanor. Eleanor untied the string and carefully unwrapped the paper to reveal a leather holster and a small revolver with a pearl handle. She looked up at Mason in confusion. "I don't understand." Mason took the weapon from her hands, checking that it was unloaded before handing it back. "It's a Remington Derringer. Ladies' gun. Easily concealed, reliable." He met her eyes directly. "After what the sheriff said today, I want you to have protection. Samuel's wife will show you how to use it. Sarah's a better shot than most men I know." Eleanor turned the small weapon over in her hands, feeling its weight. "You think I might need this?" she asked quietly. Mason's expression was solemn. "I hope not, but in this territory, it's better to be prepared." The gravity of the situation settled over Eleanor like a heavy blanket. Until now, the tension with Hardin had seemed abstract, a conflict between ranchers that didn't directly involve her. Now, holding the small pistol in her hands, she understood that Mason genuinely feared for her safety. "I'll learn to use it," she promised, setting the gun on her bedside table. Mason nodded, relief evident in his posture. He turned to leave, then hesitated at the door. "Eleanor," he said, her name soft on his lips. "I want you to know that if things become too dangerous here, I won't hold you to our arrangement. I can arrange for you to return east, with funds enough to reestablish yourself." The offer was generous and entirely unwelcome. Eleanor found herself shaking her head before he even finished speaking. "I made a promise," she said firmly. "To my father and to you. I intend to keep it." Mason studied her face intently, as if searching for uncertainty or fear. Finding none, he stepped closer, close enough that Eleanor could smell the scents of leather and horsehair that clung to him. "You're a surprising woman, Eleanor Blackwell," he said softly. "When your father wrote to me about his schoolteacher daughter, I expected someone—" He trailed off, seemingly at a loss for words. "Someone what?" Eleanor prompted, oddly breathless with his nearness. "Someone more fragile," Mason finally said. "Less determined." His blue eyes held hers, and Eleanor was suddenly acutely aware of his height, the breadth of his shoulders, the strength contained in his lean frame. Something shifted in the air between them, a tension that hadn't been there before. Mason seemed to sense it too, for he took a small step back, breaking the spell. "Good night, Eleanor," he said, his voice slightly rougher than before. "Sleep well." And with that, he was gone, closing the door softly behind him, leaving Eleanor with a small pearl-handled revolver and a fluttering sensation in her chest that she wasn't ready to examine too closely. The next morning, as promised, Sarah began teaching Eleanor how to handle the Derringer. They stood behind the smokehouse, out of sight of the main house, with tin cans arranged on fence posts as targets. "The first rule," Sarah said, as she demonstrated how to load the small gun, "is never point it at anything you don't intend to shoot. The second rule is always assume it's loaded, even when you know it isn't." Eleanor listened attentively, determined to master this new skill. The Derringer was small enough to fit easily in her hand or to be tucked into a pocket or reticule. It held only 2 shots, but at close range, Sarah assured her that would be enough to stop most threats. Eleanor's first attempts at hitting the targets were disappointing. The gun's recoil was stronger than she had anticipated, and her aim was poor. But Sarah was a patient teacher, adjusting Eleanor's stance and grip until by the end of the lesson, she could hit a can at 10 paces with reasonable consistency. "Mr. Blackwell is right to be concerned," Sarah said as they walked back to the house. "Victor Hardin is not a man to be taken lightly. He's already run 2 smaller ranchers out of the valley. Eleanor glanced at the older woman. How? If their claims were legal? Sarah shook her head. Legal means little out here when a man has money for bribes and hiring guns. The Sanderson place, 3 miles east of here, burned to the ground last spring. Everyone knew Hardin's men did it, but there was no proof. The Sandersons left the next day. A chill ran through Eleanor, despite the warm morning. And Mason? Has Hardin tried such tactics with him? Sarah's expression hardened. Once, 2 years ago, some of Hardin's men came in the night, thinking to set fire to the barn. Mr. Blackwell was waiting for them. Shot one in the shoulder, sent the rest running. Hardin's been more careful since then, more calculating. She looked at Eleanor directly. But make no mistake, Mrs. Blackwell, that man wants this land, and he won't stop until he gets it, or until someone stops him for good. The threat from Hardin cast a shadow over the ranch in the days that followed. Mason doubled the night watch, with at least 2 men awake and armed at all times. He rarely ventured far from the main buildings, and insisted that Eleanor remain within sight of the house. The constraints chafed at her, but she understood their necessity. Despite the tension, or perhaps because of it, Eleanor found herself drawing closer to Mason. They took to sharing the evening meal alone together after the hands had eaten, talking long into the night beside the fireplace. Slowly, piece by piece, Eleanor began to assemble the puzzle of her husband's past. He had fought for the Union during the war, rising to the rank of captain despite his youth. After the conflict ended, he had drifted west, working as a scout for the army, before staking his claim on the land that would become his ranch. He spoke little of his first wife, Caroline, but Eleanor sensed the depth of that loss in the careful way he avoided certain memories. In turn, Eleanor shared stories of her own life, her childhood in Pennsylvania, her mother's early death from fever, the lonely years at boarding school, her determination to become a teacher despite her father's disapproval. He wanted me to marry well, she explained one evening as they sat before the fire, Mason smoking his pipe while she mended one of his shirts. Someone with money and connections who could advance his business interests. When I refused the match he arranged, he cut off my funds. That's when I took the teaching position. Mason watched her over the bowl of his pipe, the firelight playing across his features. You chose independence over security, he observed. That takes courage. Eleanor looked up from her sewing, surprised by the compliment. It didn't feel like courage at the time, just necessity. Mason's expression softened slightly. Sometimes they're the same thing. 2 weeks after the sheriff's warning, the calm was shattered. Eleanor was in the kitchen garden, harvesting late summer vegetables with Sarah, when they heard the distant sound of gunfire from the north pasture. Sarah straightened immediately, her face paling. It seemed an eternity before she heard hoofbeats approaching the house. Peering cautiously around the edge of the curtain, she saw Mason riding hard toward the house, supporting a slumped figure on the horse beside him. Charlie, the youngest of the ranch hands. Blood darkened the young man's shirt. Behind them came Samuel and the other hand, rifles ready as they scanned the surrounding countryside. Eleanor unbarred the door and rushed out onto the porch as Mason helped Charlie from his horse. Get him inside, Mason ordered, his voice tight with suppressed rage. Eleanor and Sarah supported the wounded young man between them, helping him to the kitchen table, where Sarah quickly began cutting away his bloodied shirt. The bullet had gone clean through his shoulder, missing any vital areas, but leaving a nasty wound that bled freely. What happened? Eleanor asked as she helped Sarah clean and bandage Charlie's injury. Mason stood in the doorway, his expression thunderous, a rifle clenched in his hand. Hardin's men, he said tersely. Half a dozen of them, shooting from the trees near the north fence. They weren't after the cattle. They were waiting for us. Eleanor's blood ran cold at the implication. An ambush? Mason nodded grimly. Charlie took the bullet meant for me. If he hadn't moved when he did, he left the sentence unfinished. But Eleanor could complete it well enough in her mind. Her hands trembled slightly as she continued assisting Sarah with the bandaging. Charlie, barely 20 years old, grimaced in pain but remained stoically silent as Sarah cleaned his wound with whiskey before applying a poultice of herbs. "You'll be fine, boy," Sarah assured him. "Bullet went clean through. Keep it clean and rest that arm. You'll be good as new in a few weeks." Once Charlie was settled in the bunkhouse with a dose of laudanum for the pain, Mason called the remaining men together in the main house. Eleanor sat at the dining table with them, included in the council without question, a fact that both surprised and pleased her. "This changes things," Mason said, his voice hard as iron. "Hardin's moved from threats to attempted murder. We need to be ready." He outlined a plan to fortify the ranch. Additional men would be hired from town. The approaches to the house would be watched day and night. No one would ride alone. Samuel nodded his agreement. "Should send word to the sheriff, too," he suggested. "Taylor ought to know what Hardin's done." Mason's jaw tightened. "I'll ride into town myself tomorrow. This has gone far enough." Eleanor watched her husband as he spoke, noting the cold fury in his eyes, the tension in his powerful frame. This was a side of Mason she hadn't seen before. The soldier, the fighter, dangerous when threatened. That night, Eleanor found sleep elusive. The image of Charlie's bloodied shirt, the knowledge that the bullet had been meant for Mason, kept her mind spinning with fear and anger. Around midnight, she gave up on rest and wrapped a shawl around her nightgown before descending to the kitchen for a cup of tea. To her surprise, she found Mason already there, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and a bottle of whiskey. A map of the ranch spread before him. He looked up as she entered, surprise flashing briefly across his features before he stood. "You should be resting," he said, his voice rough with fatigue. Eleanor shook her head. "I couldn't sleep." She moved to the stove, where the kettle still held warm water, and prepared her tea before joining Mason at the table. "Neither could you, it seems." Mason sank back into his chair with a weary sigh. "Too much to think about. Too much to plan." "You're going to fight," Eleanor said. It wasn't a question. Mason's blue eyes met hers across the table. "I don't have a choice. Hardin's made it clear he won't stop until he has this land or I'm dead." He took a swallow of his whiskey-laced coffee. "I won't give him either satisfaction." Eleanor studied her husband's face in the soft lamplight. The hard lines of determination, the shadows of worry beneath his eyes, the set of his jaw that spoke of unbreakable resolve. In that moment, she realized with crystal clarity that she couldn't bear the thought of losing him. The realization shook her. When had this man, this stranger she had been forced to marry, become someone whose safety and well-being mattered so deeply to her? "There must be another way," she said softly. "Some solution that doesn't end with more bloodshed." Mason's expression softened slightly as he looked at her. "I wish there was, Eleanor. For your sake, if nothing else." He reached across the table, his large hand covering hers. "I never meant to bring you into a war. When your father wrote to me, when I agreed to this marriage, I thought Hardin was a problem I could manage. I was wrong." His thumb moved gently over her knuckles, the touch sending a current of warmth up Eleanor's arm. "If you want to leave, go back east, start over. I'll understand. I'll make all the arrangements, provide whatever you need." The offer was genuine. Eleanor could see that in his eyes. but the very thought of leaving filled her with a sense of wrongness so profound it was almost physical. "No," she said firmly, turning her hand to clasp his. "This is my home now. Our home. I won't be driven from it by threats or violence." Something flared in Mason's eyes. Surprise, respect, and something warmer that made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. "You continually surprise me, Eleanor Blackwell," he said softly, his deep voice rumbling in the quiet kitchen. Eleanor found herself leaning slightly toward him across the table, drawn by something in his expression. "You surprise me too," she admitted. "When I came here, my father arranged this marriage, I thought—" She trailed off, uncertain how to express her initial fears and assumptions. Mason's hand tightened slightly around hers. "What did you think?" he prompted. Eleanor met his gaze directly. "I thought you would be cruel," she confessed, "or at least cold. A man who would take a woman as payment for a debt. I couldn't imagine such a person being kind." Mason's expression clouded, and he started to withdraw his hand, but Eleanor held fast. "But you've been nothing but honorable and considerate. You've given me a home, freedom, respect. You've never once demanded what is legally yours to take." Mason's eyes darkened at her words. "I would never force myself on any woman, Eleanor. Especially not my wife." The way he said, "my wife," sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with fear. "I know that now," she said softly. "But there's still so much I don't understand. Why did you really agree to marry me? What promise did you make that you spoke of before?" Mason was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "I promised your mother I would look after you if anything ever happened to her." Eleanor froze, certain she had misheard. "My mother? But that's impossible. My mother died when I was 12. You couldn't have known her." Mason's gaze held steady on her face. "I knew her before that. Before she married your father. Before the war changed everything." Eleanor's mind reeled with confusion. "I don't understand," she whispered. Mason released her hand and stood, moving to the window where he stared out into the darkness. "Your mother, Elizabeth, and I grew up on neighboring farms in Missouri," he said, his back to Eleanor. "We were childhood friends. As we grew older, that friendship became something more. We planned to marry when I turned 21. He paused, his shoulders tense beneath his shirt. "Then the war came. I enlisted in the Union Army, believing it would be over quickly. But before I left, I asked Elizabeth to wait for me, and she promised she would." He turned to face Eleanor, his expression raw with old pain. 2 years later, I received a letter. She had married Thomas Thompson, a businessman from Pennsylvania who had contracts with the Union Army. She wrote that she couldn't wait any longer, that she needed security in such uncertain times. Eleanor gripped the edge of the table, her mind struggling to process this revelation. "You and my mother were in love?" Mason's expression softened slightly. "We were very young. But yes, I believe we were. After I received her letter, I met and married Caroline. I tried to put Elizabeth from my mind." He moved back to the table, though he didn't sit. "Years later, after Caroline died, I received another letter from your mother. She was ill, dying, and worried about you. Thomas had become bitter, distant. She feared what would become of you once she was gone. She asked me, as someone who had once cared for her, to watch over her daughter if I could." His blue eyes held Eleanor steadily. "I promised I would, though I had no idea how to fulfill that promise from halfway across the country. When your father wrote to me last month, speaking of his debt and offering you in marriage, I saw it as a chance to keep the promise I made to Elizabeth all those years ago. Eleanor felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Her entire understanding of her parents, of her own history, had been upended in an instant. "My father knew?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Mason nodded. "He knew of my connection to your mother. Yes, I believe that's why he sought me out after the war, why he proposed a business partnership. Perhaps to prove something to himself, or to her memory." His expression hardened slightly. The partnership failed because of his dishonesty. He embezzled funds, left me nearly ruined. I rebuilt my life, came west, started over. I never expected to hear from him again, until his letter arrived, telling me of his illness and offering you as settlement for his old debt. Eleanor pressed a hand to her mouth, overwhelmed by these revelations. "So our marriage was a way for me to honor my promise to your mother," Mason said quietly, "and perhaps a way for your father to make amends, in his own twisted fashion." He moved around the table to stand beside Eleanor's chair, looking down at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I never intended to claim a husband's rights, Eleanor. I meant only to provide you with a home, security, protection, the things your mother wanted for you. But I never expected—" He trailed off, seeming to struggle for words. "You never expected what?" Eleanor prompted, rising from her chair to face him. They stood close now, close enough that she could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Mason's gaze dropped to her lips for the briefest moment before returning to her eyes. "I never expected to feel this way again," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion, "to want to be more than just your protector." The confession hung in the air between them, charged with meaning and possibility. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest as she looked up at this man who had been a stranger to her just weeks ago. This man who had known her mother, who had promised to protect her, who now stood before her with vulnerability in his eyes that belied his strength. Without conscious thought, Eleanor raised her hand to Mason's face, her fingers gently tracing the scar along his jaw. "And how do you want to be?" she whispered. Mason's eyes darkened at her touch, his breath catching audibly. For a long moment, he remained perfectly still, as if afraid any movement might shatter the moment. Then, slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand to cover hers against his cheek. "I want to be your husband," he said softly, "in every way. If that's what you want too." Eleanor had never been bold with men. Her upbringing and education had taught her propriety and restraint in all things. But standing in the kitchen with Mason, his hand warm against hers, his eyes filled with a longing that matched her own, she found courage she hadn't known she possessed. Rising on her toes, she pressed her lips to his, a tentative, questioning kiss. Mason remained still for only a heartbeat before responding, his arms encircling her waist and drawing her closer as he deepened the kiss. His lips were warm and sure against hers, the faint taste of whiskey and coffee mingling with something that was uniquely him. Eleanor's arms wound around his neck as she surrendered to the sensations flooding through her. Warmth, desire, a sense of rightness that left her breathless. When they finally parted, Mason rested his forehead against hers, his breathing as unsteady as her own. "Eleanor," he murmured, her name a caress on his lips. "Are you sure?" In answer, she kissed him again, pouring all her newfound certainty into the gesture. In the soft lamplight of the kitchen, Eleanor and Mason found a new beginning. not as strangers bound by a forced arrangement, but as two people choosing each other freely, their pasts intertwined in ways they were only beginning to understand. When Mason finally lifted Eleanor into his arms and carried her upstairs to his bedroom, their bedroom now, it was with a tenderness that belied his strength. And when they came together as husband and wife, for the first time, it was with a passion born of genuine feeling rather than mere obligation or desire. Later, as they lay tangled in the sheets, Eleanor's head pillowed on Mason's chest, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. "I think my mother would be pleased," she whispered against his skin. Mason's arms tightened around her. "I think so too," he agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Outside, the first light of dawn began to creep across the Arizona sky. A new day breaking over the ranch that had become their shared home. The morning brought clarity and resolve, along with a newfound intimacy between Eleanor and Mason. As they dressed for the day, preparing for Mason's ride into town to speak with the sheriff, the air between them was charged with unspoken emotion and shared purpose. "I'll be back before sundown," Mason promised as he strapped on his gun belt. Eleanor handed him his hat, her fingers lingering against his. "Be careful," she urged. "Hardin might have men watching the town." Mason nodded, his expression serious. "I'll take Samuel and Jim with me. We'll stay alert." Before he left, he drew Eleanor into his arms for a kiss that spoke of all they had discovered in each other through the night, and all they stood to lose if Hardin had his way. "Remember what Sarah taught you," Mason murmured against her hair. "Keep the derringer close." Eleanor nodded, her arms tightening briefly around his waist before she stepped back, allowing him to leave. From the porch, she watched until he and the two hands disappeared from view, an uneasy feeling settling in the pit of her stomach, despite the joy of the previous night. The day stretched endlessly as Eleanor waited for Mason's return. She helped Sarah tend to Charlie's wound, worked in the garden, and tried to lose herself in one of Mason's books, but her thoughts kept returning to the danger her husband faced. By mid-afternoon, dark clouds had gathered on the horizon, promising one of the sudden, violent storms that sometimes swept across the territory. Sarah watched the sky with concern as she and Eleanor prepared the evening meal. "They should have been back by now," the older woman muttered. Glancing toward the road for the dozenth time, Eleanor felt her unease deepen. "Could the sheriff have detained them for some reason?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Sarah shook her head. "Sheriff Taylor's a friend to Mr. Blackwell. He wouldn't keep him in town with a storm coming, not with Hardin's men about." The first rumble of thunder sounded in the distance, and both women exchanged worried glances. As the storm drew closer, Jeb, the hand left behind to guard the ranch, moved restlessly between the windows, his rifle never far from his grasp. "Something ain't right," he muttered, echoing the fear that had been growing in Eleanor's heart. "Mr. Blackwell's too smart to get caught in a storm like this. He knows the signs." A flash of lightning illuminated the darkening landscape, followed almost immediately by a crack of thunder that shook the windows. Rain began to lash against the glass, driven by a howling wind that seemed to seek entry at every seam and crack in the house's sturdy construction. Eleanor stood at the front window, straining to see through the downpour, her hand resting on the small derringer in her pocket. "We should light the lantern on the porch," she decided. "If they're nearby, it might guide them home." Jeb nodded, moving to light the large storm lantern that hung on the porch ceiling. No sooner had he stepped outside than a shot rang out, the sound nearly lost in a thunderclap. "Jeb!" Eleanor cried, rushing to the door, in time to see the ranch hand staggering back onto the porch, clutching his side where blood bloomed dark against his shirt. "Get back," he gasped, shoving her inside and slamming the door behind them. Sarah was already there, helping Jed to a chair as Eleanor barred the door. "Riders!" Jeb panted through gritted teeth. At least 4, maybe more, coming fast through the trees. Sarah pressed a cloth against his wound, her face grim. "Hardin's men?" she asked. Jeb nodded weakly. "Has to be. They were waiting for the storm as cover." Eleanor's mind raced. Mason and the others were still gone. Charlie was wounded and feverish in the bunkhouse. It was just the 3 of them, a wounded man, an older woman, and herself, against an unknown number of armed attackers. Her hand closed around the derringer in her pocket. "Sarah," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice, "get the shotgun." The next minutes passed in a blur of desperate preparation. Sarah retrieved the shotgun and extra shells from the cabinet, while Eleanor helped Jed to a position behind the overturned dining table, where he could cover the front door with his rifle, despite his injury. Sarah took up position near the kitchen door, which opened onto the back porch. Eleanor moved between the windows, the derringer ready in her hand, watching for movement through the driving rain. Lightning flashed again, illuminating a figure darting between the barn and the bunkhouse. "They're trying to circle around," she called to the others. No sooner had she spoken than a shot shattered one of the front windows, sending glass spraying across the floor. Eleanor ducked instinctively, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was no longer an abstract threat. It was happening, now, and Mason wasn't here to protect them. The realization struck her with sudden clarity. They were on their own, and their lives depended on their actions in the next few minutes. Drawing a deep breath, Eleanor recalled everything Sarah had taught her about the derringer, everything she had observed of Mason's calm courage in the face of danger. "Jeb," she called over the storm's fury, "can you still shoot?" The wounded man nodded grimly, bracing his rifle against the edge of the overturned table. "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor moved to Sarah's side. "When they come, they'll likely try both doors at once," she said, the tactical assessment surprising even herself. "We need to make them think there are more of us." Sarah nodded her understanding, a new respect in her eyes as she regarded her employer's young wife. "We'll give them a warm welcome they won't soon forget," the older woman promised, checking the shotgun's load with practiced hands. The attack came with the next lightning flash, a thunderous crash as something heavy slammed against the front door, followed by shots fired through the windows. Jeb returned fire, his aim true despite his wound, and a cry of pain from outside told Eleanor he had found his mark. At the rear of the house, shadows moved across the back porch. "Sarah!" Eleanor called in warning, just as the kitchen door shuddered under a powerful blow. Sarah's shotgun roared in response, the blast tearing through the wooden door and eliciting another shout of pain from beyond. Eleanor positioned herself between the 2 defensive points, ready to assist either Jeb or Sarah as needed, the derringer steady in her hand despite her racing heart. The storm raged around them, wind and rain lashing at the house as lightning split the sky and thunder rolled across the valley. A sudden lull in the gunfire gave Eleanor a moment to catch her breath. "They're regrouping," Jeb warned, his voice weak but determined as he reloaded his rifle. "Probably didn't expect so much resistance." Eleanor nodded, moving cautiously to check on Sarah, who stood grimly by the kitchen door, reloading the shotgun with steady hands. "Are you all right?" Eleanor asked. The older woman nodded, though her face was pale with tension. "Never better, Mrs. Blackwell. Just wish Mr. Mason was here with that colt of his." As if in answer to her wish, the sound of galloping hooves cut through the storm's fury, accompanied by shouts and a sudden volley of gunfire from beyond the house. Eleanor's heart leaped with hope and fear. "Mason," she breathed, moving to the front window to peer through the broken glass. Through the rain and darkness, she could make out the shapes of riders engaged in a firefight with Hardin's men, who were now caught in the open between the house and the new arrivals. "It's them," Jeb confirmed, his voice stronger with renewed hope. "Mr. Blackwell and the boys, and looks like they brought the sheriff too." The gunfight outside intensified, muzzle flashes piercing the stormy darkness like miniature lightning strikes. Eleanor's grip tightened on her derringer as she watched, feeling helpless yet determined to defend the house if any of Hardin's men made another attempt on the doors. A particularly loud exchange of gunfire drew her attention to the side of the house, where a shadowy figure was attempting to climb through a broken window. Without hesitation, Eleanor raised her derringer and fired. The intruder cried out and fell backward, disappearing into the rainy darkness. Heart pounding, she moved quickly to the window, the small gun still clutched in her trembling hand. Through the shattered glass and driving rain, she could see the man sprawled, motionless on the ground. The gunfire outside gradually subsided, giving way to shouted commands that were barely audible over the storm. Eleanor strained to hear Mason's voice among them, but could distinguish nothing clearly. Jeb had slumped further behind the table, his face alarmingly pale, while Sarah maintained her vigilant position by the kitchen door. Minutes that felt like hours passed before a familiar voice called from the porch. "Eleanor! Sarah! It's Mason! It's over!" Eleanor nearly collapsed with relief, rushing to unbar the door. Mason stood on the threshold, rain-soaked and splattered with mud, a bleeding gash across his forehead, but otherwise unharmed. His eyes sought hers immediately. Sheriff Taylor and his deputies took custody of 2 wounded attackers, the only survivors of Hardin's men. Mason and Samuel tended to Jeb's wound, while one of the deputies, who had some medical training, saw to Charlie in the bunkhouse. Jim built up the fire and boiled water for coffee and bandages. Through it all, Eleanor moved with a steady purpose, assisting where needed, her derringer returned to its holster, but never far from reach. It was only when the wounded had been tended, the prisoners secured, and the immediate danger past that she allowed the full weight of the day's events to settle upon her. She sank into a chair by the fire, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. Mason found her there a short while later, after conferring with the sheriff on the porch. He had cleaned the blood from his face, though the cut on his forehead would likely leave yet another scar. Without a word, he knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "When we came over that rise and saw the gunfire," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I thought I'd lost you." Eleanor squeezed his hands, drawing strength from his solid presence. "We held them off," she said simply. "Sarah and Jeb and I." Mason's blue eyes searched her face, finding a new strength there that matched his own. "You saved the ranch," he said. "You saved our home." The way he said "our home" filled Eleanor with a warmth that pushed back the lingering chill of fear. The sheriff entered, removing his hat as he approached the fire. "Hardin was behind it, all right," he confirmed. "One of the prisoners confessed. Hardin ordered them to burn you out. Figured with the storm for cover, no one would know who did it." He glanced at Mason. "But he didn't count on you cutting through Miller's Pass to avoid the flooding at the creek crossing." and he sure didn't count on your wife and hands putting up such a fight." Sheriff Taylor's weathered face broke into a grim smile. "Hardin himself is waiting at his ranch. I'm riding there now with my deputies to arrest him for attempted murder and property destruction. With these witnesses, he'll hang Mason. It's over." Mason stood, extending his hand to the sheriff. "Thank you, John, for everything." The two men shook hands, a gesture that spoke of years of friendship and mutual respect. After the sheriff departed, Mason turned back to Eleanor. "It is over," he said softly. "Hardin can't hurt us anymore." Eleanor rose from her chair, moving into the circle of Mason's arms. "What happened in town?" she asked, remembering the long, anxious hours of waiting. Mason sighed, his breath stirring her hair. "Hardin had men watching the sheriff's office. When we arrived, they followed us. There was a confrontation in the street. Nothing serious, but enough to delay us. By the time we started home, the storm was moving in fast. We tried to beat it by taking the pass, and that's when we saw the gunfire at the ranch." He held her tighter, as if still afraid she might disappear. "If we'd been any later—" "But you weren't," Eleanor said firmly, looking up into his face. "You came home exactly when we needed you most." The simple truth of her words seemed to touch something deep in Mason. He cupped her face in his rough hands, his blue eyes intense in the firelight. "I will always come home to you, Eleanor. Always." And then he was kissing her, a kiss that spoke of fear overcome, of danger faced together, of a future now secured. Eleanor returned his kiss with equal fervor, her arms winding around his neck as she gave herself to the moment and to the man who had become so much more than just her husband. In the weeks that followed, life at the Blackwell Ranch slowly returned to normal. Jeb recovered from his wound under Sarah's careful nursing. The damaged windows and doors were repaired. The north fence, where the trouble had begun, was rebuilt stronger than before. And with Hardin awaiting trial in the territorial prison, the threat that had hung over the ranch for so long was finally lifted. Mason and Eleanor settled into a new rhythm together, no longer strangers bound by an arrangement, but partners in every sense. Their days filled with the work of the ranch, and their nights with the joy of discovery. One evening in late fall, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the valley in gold and crimson, Mason took Eleanor's hand in his. "I've been thinking," he said, his deep voice warm in the gathering dusk, "about the future, about us." Eleanor turned to look at him, the last light of day illuminating his strong profile. "What about us?" she prompted when he fell silent. Mason met her gaze, a rare vulnerability in his blue eyes. "When your father arranged our marriage, when I agreed to it because of my promise to your mother, I never expected this." He gestured between them, words failing him momentarily. "I never expected to love again, Eleanor, but I do. I love you, not because of a promise or an arrangement, but because of who you are." Eleanor's heart swelled with emotion at his words, at the naked sincerity in his expression. "I love you too, Mason," she whispered, the truth of it resonating through her entire being. "Not because you were chosen for me, but because I've chosen you." Mason's hand tightened around hers, his other hand moving to touch the small swell of her stomach, a secret they had only confirmed the week before. "We're going to build something here," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "Something that will last long after we're gone. A legacy for our child and any others that might come." Eleanor covered his hand with her own, feeling the strength and gentleness in his touch. "Our home," she agreed, leaning her head against his shoulder, as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the eastern sky. As darkness settled over the Blackwell Ranch, Eleanor thought of the journey that had brought her here. From the reluctant bride forced to marry a stranger, to the woman who had found not just security, but love and purpose in the arms of that same man. Mason's kiss had indeed revealed the secret he had been hiding. Not just his connection to her mother, but his capacity for love, for tenderness, for building a life together on this wild frontier. Whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them together. No longer strangers, but partners. No longer forced, but chosen. Their lives and hearts intertwined like the roots of the trees that lined the creek flowing through their land. Deep, strong, and enduring.